Good day, everyone. I think we have a stable number of participants now, so let's begin. So welcome to this new edition of XBRL Direction webinars. My name is Catalina Ibañez Gutierrez. I am the chair of the Implementation Awareness Task Force. I am an XBRL consultant and also an XBRL expert at Lucanet Amana. The topic of our webinar from today is taxonomy versioning and communicating changes. Today, we had with us a high-level speaker, Dr. Belle Russell, co-chair of the Taxonomy Design Working Group and a Strategic Market and Innovation Director at Corey Filen. Thank you, Ben, for joining us today. So if you have any questions, please use the FAQ option. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time to answer them. So Ben, the stage is yours, please.
Thank you, Catalina. So yes, I'm Ben Russell, co-chair of the Taxonomy Design Working Group. And today I have the pleasure of presenting two pieces of guidance that we have published. I will cover the main recommendations today, but I highly recommend you looking at the full guidance and actually seeing more about the topics. A lot of work goes into these to lay out all of the arguments and the characteristics and consequences of decisions that you can make, and you can really benefit from reading that. So we look first at the taxonomy versioning guidance, and this doesn't go into things like source control, automated testing, taxonomy management systems, those type of things. Rather, the guidance covers more of an external view of versioning and what requirements we might have in that area. So there are very few taxonomies that are never updated, maybe none. And when legislation or data standards or the focus of the data collection change, then these are business changes, and they need to be reflected in the data collection and therefore reflected in the taxonomy. On the other hand, when improvements are made to submission systems, if we have new consumers or new use cases, or there are enhancements to technical standards, then these might drive technical changes. And what's important for both is that when people have a taxonomy in their hand, or they're configuring a system with it, they need to be able to identify which version of the taxonomy which one's being used. And perhaps the most obvious place where the importance is seen is when you have an XBRL report and you want to make sense of it. So in order to make sense of it, you need to reference the exact version of the taxonomy it was reported against. And even if the contents hasn't changed, what defines a valid filing might have changed. And the correct taxonomy version is required to apply the correct data quality rules and to know what to expect with that filing. So we're going to go over a few different aspects of taxonomy versioning. These are the items that are covered in the guidance. We'll start with looking at planning taxonomy releases, and that will inform versioning schemes, and then we go on to where to use version markers, and then finally the guidance covers some items around hot fixes, which are a reality of life and important to cover in practical guidance. So we move on to the first aspect around planning taxonomy releases. So the guidance presents a few different characteristics that are fundamental to managing the taxonomy lifecycle. And these in turn are going to help us make decisions around other aspects of versioning. When we answer these questions, what we end up with is a set of requirements up front for what our versioning should be actually trying to achieve. So it starts off with how often do reporting requirements change? This is closely linked to where change comes from. Do we have change driven by external factors, things like legislation, or is it entirely within our control? Do we have control over the taxonomy completely? And these will often tell you how often those requirements will change. And that leads naturally on to our change cycle. So are we in a fixed environment where changes are only possible once per year? Or can we carry out changes throughout the year, or do we do them much less frequently, or do we just do them when they're needed? And so we can define our planned release cycle as either being periodic or agile. And then we go away from our internal factors and start to consider the other people who need to deal with taxonomy change. So often time will need to be put aside for consultation. And then the various parties involved will also need to have time to make changes they need to make. And this can be anyone. This can be people this can be accountants or auditors. It can be IT teams or software companies. They all need time before you start collecting for a new taxonomy. So the guidance recommends figuring all this out, just so you know what the principles and parameters are for your changes, or how you're going to present those changes. So these are quite high-level concerns. We're actually going to go straight down now into some lower level, more basic, fundamental ones. One of the things that people always have to do, you have to do this, is to choose a versioning scheme. Now, these are used to communicate when someone has a taxonomy in their hand. The versioning scheme is used to communicate what version they actually have in their hand. And we have two main methods, two main versioning schemes recommended. We say you should either use a date, which might be a year, or it might actually be a full date, such as in that US GAAP example on the screen, or it might have a versioning number, as in the other example. We recommend this 3-part version number, which is commonly used with software as well. Now, the one you should choose should be linked to the taxonomy release cycle. And so if you have an annual cycle, then it may make sense to have a year as being your versioning scheme. But importantly, it should also be able to be followed no matter what kind of updates happen or unexpected things happen. So if you always release taxonomies on a periodic cycle, then you might want that date-based scheme. But if your taxonomies are released when needed, then dates are going to kind of lose their meaning over time, and version numbers are generally better. But you have this third case where you want to release your taxonomy periodically, but there might be several versions before the final one is confirmed, or you might need to do an inter-year update, and we should still be able to use our scheme consistently. It shouldn't cause confusion when that happens. And in those cases, the date isn't enough. And so many people have now started using combination of dates and numbers. It makes sense to them. So once we've decided on our best versioning scheme, the one that fits our release cycle and what we expect to be able to deal with, then we want to put these values where people can actually see them. Different people work with taxonomies in different ways. Some people go straight into opening files. Some people are only looking at them through some specialist software. Some people are just looking at file names. Some people are looking at descriptions on websites and so on. And we want to put these version numbers where they're actually useful for all these people. And so there are a few different areas within XBRL taxonomies where you can add these. We have the taxonomy file URLs. We have taxonomy packages. We have namespaces. We have file names. And we recommend in the guidance to put version markings in all these places, so that whatever level you're working on, you know what version you have. And to avoid confusion, and frankly, as an improvement to what is common practice at the moment, the same version identifier should be used in all of these places, so that when someone technical is talking about their version and they have a date, and someone from business is talking about the taxonomy version and they have a number, there's no confusion raised if you use them consistently. And the final item that the guidance covers is hot fixes. Now, these are bug fixes or last-minute changes, and they raise a problem for us that we need to make a change, or the taxonomy author needs to make a change, and people do need to use the new version. It's very important they use the version that doesn't have this bug in. But we don't want to cause more work than necessary, and don't want to reset all the work that people have done already at what might be a fairly late stage in the process. So in this case, the only place we recommend changing the version markings is in the taxonomy package. And this means that you avoid making changes to the deeper definitions, the more technical places within the taxonomy. And that really concludes the main points from the managing taxonomy version guidance. There's a lot more detail in the guidance itself. But let's look a bit beyond telling people what version they're looking at and think about communicating the changes that have been made between the versions. So why do we communicate taxonomy changes? Well, basically, it's just good practice, best practice for the good of the whole data collection program. How well you do this directly will impact the filer burden. So we recognize that it's not just the taxonomy author or the data collector that's affected by these changes. There are preparers who might be accountants or reporting teams. There are auditors, there are consumers of data. And across all of these usually sit software vendors or IT teams who need to handle the change technically on behalf of their customers or the people they look after. So the guidance covers how to communicate these changes, and we'll have a look at some of the main recommendations now. And as with versioning, and actually as with most of the guidance we put out, the first step is actually understanding the problem and understanding what you have in front of you. And in this case, we want to understand the changes that we're putting in, specifically the type of change. So the guidance recommends characterizing your changes into architecture, which might include something like adding a new part of the specification to the taxonomy, but are generally large impact, infrequent changes to the architecture of the taxonomy. We then have content changes, which might be considered normal changes. It's just adding and removing things, removing reporting points from the taxonomy. And finally, there are filing rule changes. These are not in the taxonomy themselves. The whole filing rules usually sit outside the taxonomy, but they will indirectly impact the contents and, for instance, whether a filing is valid or not. And there's a lot more detail about how to identify which of these you have in the guidance. So now we want to match the type of change that we recognize we have with some suitable communication. For architectural changes, we want people to know not just what the change is, but how they can benefit from it and use the new features that are being added. So we recommend always providing some narrative summary, which includes a business or a technical rationale and says what impact this should have on the stakeholders. Should it make things easier to do, or things done in a slightly different way? Those are the type of things we want to tell people. And the guidance actually goes into a fair amount of detail about architectural changes and gives a three-phase way of making such changes and the communications involved that enable you to engage with the ecosystem before you actually update the taxonomy. And for these type of changes, that is best practice and the way to get the best result from the changes. We should also recognize that, so it's particularly important for architectural changes, there's lots of user-friendly features based on assumptions around architecture as well. And so we don't want to make things worse. Then the guidance covers content changes. Now, we do talk about some of the technical difference reports that you can produce. But actually, the guidance puts quite a strong emphasis on things that can't be derived from a pure technical comparison between a set of taxonomy files. That arguably is something that anyone could create by themselves. So we're saying that one of the main things to focus on is providing that business-oriented description of the change. And this will enable people to actually take your change and take some actions quickly based on what you've said. So even if they need to know whether they need to set up a meeting with particular people, the change report, if it does things like include the amount of change and the business background and the rationale, then it enables people to quickly take the actions they need with the changes that you've put in. And then for filing rules, we said they're not in the taxonomy, and we recommend just keeping it simple, indicating changes in the filing rule documentation itself. And there is some separate related guidance around publishing filing rules in general, which I've linked on the screen. So in summary, communicating these taxonomy changes, when you're doing this, consistency is really the key. And it lets people gain trust in what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and also be much more engaged and allow you to have that engaged filing program that builds efficiencies as you go on. And we can do this by always releasing change information. We can do this by being very clear about what we're going to do and be consistent about doing it. Have a lot of discipline in how we communicate changes. Documents should explain the changes, not just say what they are, but actually explain them. And in particular, you might think that it's just you explaining to taxonomy users what the changes are, but they will often also have to explain to someone else why things have been done. And that makes their life easier. And then thinking about that whole ecosystem, the communication methods should be required for them. There's no point in putting out very technical things where business people are going to be reading them. There's no point in putting out very high-level things when all the changes are deeply technical. And finally, what we've seen in successful programs or programs where change doesn't seem to be an issue is there's a lot of advance notice. Often a calendar of releases will be put out, actually saying when exactly changes will happen. That makes them very easy to consume. So I said at the beginning, the guidance itself has a lot more discussion and explanation around these main recommendations. Well worth reading. The titles are on the slide and can be found on the XBRL International website under guidance. But that's the end of this quick skim through the main recommendations in the guidance.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Ben, for your presentation and explanation of these two guidance. The Implementation Awareness Task Force had prepared some questions for you, so let's have a chat on these questions. So let's start with a basic one. Who is the intended audience for these two guidance? And are they relevant only for taxonomy authors, or are they also relevant for users?
Yeah, so it's worth being clear that this is most of what the Taxonomy Design Working Group puts out will be aimed at taxonomy authors, because in the end they're having to make decisions. These decisions sit with them, and so I would say it's primarily aimed at them. But it's also quite useful to know from if you're given a taxonomy, to know things like, well, where are people going to put their version markings? It can be quite useful. And one of the things that we're also keen on in the working group is actually getting the best practice taken on more broadly. And if you know where you should expect to find things or what you should expect to be happening and it's not, then taxonomy authors are generally pretty good at receiving that kind of feedback and finding out what makes life easier for you. And you might find something in here that you wished that your taxonomy author would do to make your life easier. So it could also be read by people consuming taxonomies.
The next question is related to versioning taxonomies release. So why is it important to uniquely identify each version of a taxonomy? And maybe you have some examples?
Yeah, I'd say one of the main things you get from inconsistent versioning or sometimes no versioning at all is cost. It's pure cost. And what's worse is it tends to be quite hidden cost. Very few people are going to admit that they've wasted weeks working with something where it could be seen that they have made the mistake of selecting the wrong version. But there is a fair amount of responsibility on the people releasing the taxonomy to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen, because in the end it just adds to the filing burden. All these hidden costs add up in the end. One example I can think of where versioning did cause some confusion, there was a taxonomy published that every year was having a yearly annual update. So it was 2020, 2021, 2022, and so on. But then in 2023, they decided that there wasn't enough changes to make an annual update. And so they added a V1.1 to the 2022 marking. Now, this can be quite confusing because you're basically now telling, you have to explain now to everyone who's using your software or using this taxonomy that no, in 2023, you used the 2022 V1.1 taxonomy. And it instantly starts to not make sense and just adds friction to the whole reporting program that is frankly unneeded. So yeah, it's really important and should be simple as well, really, to get right.
Let's move on versioning scheme topic. What factors should taxonomy authors consider when choosing a version scheme?
Yeah, I think the guidance really is around choosing a versioning scheme that works for you and makes sense to people. There are versioning schemes where the numbers or dates are often used that just lose their meaning in time, and I don't think those are the best ones. I think the ones where the version still makes sense, say 4 years on from when it was released. But the way you can become unstuck is if you have things like a draft version or a hot fix or something like that, and those are the things that should be thought of up front, so that you also know where you're going to put all those kind of pieces of information as well. So I think in general, the combination ones work quite well for people. But they're all perfectly valid, just as long as they're used consistently.
Thank you. And the last one about taxonomy versioning, in which location should the taxonomy version identifier be reflected?
Yeah, so in the presentation, we gave a whole bunch of different places where this can be. Now it's good to put your taxonomy version in the namespace, but that's probably not the main place that most of us are going to start looking for that information. And so, and also I think if you pick up a taxonomy just at random from the wild, that probably is not the right place to be looking to get an understanding of what version of the taxonomy you're looking at. The taxonomy package, I think, is the primary place for most people to worry about. Everything else follows on from there, and it may be convenient or useful for people. It is convenient and useful for people to have it in other places, but that's the main place, the main location that I would be making sure is correct. And if you release 2 taxonomies and they have the same version in the taxonomy package, you're really making it very hard for people to understand what they actually have.
Thank you, Ben. It was really useful information. So remember that if you have any questions, you can type it in the FAQ, and we will see the question, and we can also take some time on answer those. But I have some other question about how to communicate the changes. So the first question is related type of changes. Why do different audiences require different levels of detail when taxonomy changes occur?
So they basically need to do different things with the information. And if we look at a change, there's some big changes, content changes that have been done in the IFRS taxonomy over the years, for instance. So on the face of it, then they could be described as not that, they're just standard content changes, but the business reason behind them is quite big. So you have things like IFRS 9 being introduced. I think it's IFRS 18, so the new main statements. You can look at, if I give those changes to someone quite technical, they'll be okay with them. They're just some things added, some things removed, and they just need that information about what's added, what's removed, and they can move on. But when you give that to a business person or someone who's actually trying to arrange this, or someone from the reporting team, they'll look at those as really big major changes, and they need to know why it's happening. They need to be able to be involved in the consultations and all those other things. So there are lots of different audiences for taxonomies and data standards in general, and you kind of can't ignore any of them if you want to have a nice, smooth filing program.
The next one is about architectural changes. So what are some examples of architectural changes in taxonomy? And is there any particular example of how one was successfully communicated?
Yeah, so the guidance does give some examples, like specific examples of changes. Introducing new parts of the XBRL standard, or like following the XBRL standard as it evolves. So a good example would be assertion severities. So these were things added to XBRL to allow you, the taxonomy author, to say that some data rules were errors, like something was wrong, and others were just warnings. Like it was just, normally these numbers add up in this way and they don't for yours. So that would be an architectural change, and a good one, because it means that people can now add those user-friendly features into their software that show these things as warnings or errors or whatever it might be. Also, sometimes things get removed from the standard or fall out of favor. So those of us who've been around a long time will know that tuples used to be a very big thing, and but now they're pretty much phased out. There are other architectural changes that are in the guidance as well. One, perhaps, when you ask this, the taxonomy that comes to mind that has been around for a long time, a continuous set of changes, is the FASB SEC taxonomy, so the XBRL US GAP taxonomy. I think it's been out for 15, maybe more years now, but it's kept up with the times, and they've only managed to do that. Well, over that time, they have refined the way they do these major changes. And so I think looking at the way that they trail their changes and then consult on them and actually take the feedback and do something with it is quite good. It's a good example of someone who's an organization that's maybe made all the mistakes now and is doing things in the right way.
Thank you. So I don't see any other question from the audience. So if you have any question, please use the opportunity. We have here the expert with us. But if there is any question, I have another one that I have here. Is taxonomy changes communication only in one way? I mean, it looks like this is only from the author to the user, but it could be also the other way around.
Yeah, I think there are quite a lot of XBRL experts out there, and quite a lot of people who rely on taxonomies being a certain way or prefer them a certain way. There are quite a lot of people who understand the way that the reports should be organized. And I think if you only go one direction, then you actually miss out. In the end, it's net loss to your data collection to not allow people to give their point of view and listen to it and understand what makes their life easier or what makes the taxonomy better. So we talk in the guidance about two main places where this might happen. One of them is for those architectural changes. So, you can find out that everyone's life can be made an awful lot easier by just making a small tweak to the way you're doing something. But you'll only ever know that if you ask. And the other one is around content changes. And depending on the environment that it's in and what kind of how engaged your audience is, putting out consultations on taxonomy contents also can stop you making even just logical errors, like missing out on certain categories that you might not have thought of when you're writing the taxonomy. It'd be really useful just to avoid those type of errors.
Yeah. So the very last one that I have is, what role do filing rules play in taxonomy changes communication? I think it's an important one because we have also a new version also of the filing rules that are coming with the taxonomy as well.
Yeah, filing rules, they're a bit of a funny outlier in data collection with XBRL, and one that I think there's some steps being taken to maybe stop having so many filing rules. They are important in that if you don't follow them, then even a small change to a small rule might mean that suddenly your reports are no longer accepted, and so that somehow makes them worthy of some special thought that goes around them. Also, small changes can have major technical impacts. As always with filing rules, I think the position of the Taxonomy Design Working Group is that really the standard is usually enough, and filing rules on top of the standard is often unnecessary. But if you are going to put filing rules in, and you might have some that you absolutely need, then yes, communicating these and telling people when they change, probably giving people as much time as possible to deal with them is sensible as well. Yeah.
Thank you. So we don't have any more questions. So thank you again, Ben, for your presentation and for your answers, of course. I think we are now aware of the relevance of this guidance, and thank you very much for dear members and dear audience to join us today. And I wish you a wonderful day and see you at the next time. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Kathleen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.